Imagine you're sitting in a busy doctor's clinic waiting for an appointment. The doctor's running late, so you're growing impatient. The door finally opens, and I step out. I call out your name. As you rise from your chair, I say, "Hi, my name is Marrwah, and I am the doctor who will be looking after you today." How do you think you would respond in that moment? It's not a trick question, but it seems like a silly one, right? The most obvious answer would be something like, "It's nice to meet you," or "How are you going?" Or even, "Gee, Doc, you're running late today." But what if I told you that some of the responses I've received to this introduction over the last few years have been things like, "No offense, but I don't like people like you." Or, "Are you even a doctor? I didn't think your foreign qualifications would measure up here." Or, "I only speak to people with Australian visas." I chose to laugh that one off by saying, "It's all good, mate. I have an Australian passport." When I tell my friends these stories, like many of you, they are shocked. And yet research would suggest that my experience is not a unique one. Last year, a survey of 1,006 Australians revealed that 51% of respondents harboured negative sentiments towards Islam. And yet that same study also revealed that 47% of participants had no friends or very few friends from a background different to their own. Now, there was one important bias in this study, and that was that the majority of respondents were from the same cultural background. But still, it raised an important point, that ignorance, amongst other things, can lead to unfavourable sentiments. I mean, I don't consider ignorance to be a bad thing. In fact, I'd like to think that we're all tossed into its vast ocean from the moment we're born. If we acknowledge and recognise our ignorance, we can use that energy to swim towards shores of enlightenment. Conversations are valuable lifeboats in these murky waters because they allow us to connect with others, to appreciate their perspectives, and to recognise our shared humanity. If we don't swim, or we don't use these lifeboats when we need them to, then we risk drowning in the same waters that ironically could have pushed us to new frontiers. And what happens when we drown? We flail, and we may pull others down with us. It is estimated that the cost of racial discrimination alone to our nation is $38 billion every year. We live in a nation of rich cultural pluralism, where the opportunity to find people of different backgrounds to connect with should be endless. So back to my point about diverse experiences within Australia and cultural pluralism. The original owners of this land represent the world's oldest civilization. 1/4 of Australians were born overseas, and a further 20% of Australians have at least one parent who is a migrant. So why aren't we connecting over our diverse experiences? When I was in primary school, I would often come home in tears, telling my parents that I had been teased again. Much of the teasing, as you can imagine, gravitated around my headscarf or my hijab. One day my father sat me down and he told me that it sounded like most of these kids were probably curious because they probably hadn't met someone who wore a hijab before. And this was true because I was the only kid in my school who wore one. He suggested that I ask the teacher for an opportunity to stand in front of my class and explain what it meant to me. he said that if I did that, chances are most of the students would understand and leave me alone. So picture mini-me, standing in front of this class, knees knocking wildly. You can't imagine how daunting it was. I had very few friends at the time and even less confidence. So it took some serious mustering of courage to stand in front of that class and say a few simple words. What I said was not particularly monumental, nor was it really eloquent, but it was enough. Enough to humanize me to all those children, to allow them to understand that underneath it all, we were the same. I was a kid just like them, and I wanted the same things that they did: to get through school, to enjoy a carefree childhood, and ultimately, to be accepted. Amazingly, after that day, and after that simple talk, I was largely left alone for the remainder of time that I spent at that school. It was the most crucial lesson I would learn, and one I have carried with me throughout my life: the power of storytelling in breaking down barriers. Without knowing someone's story, we fail to look at them beyond the biases we attribute to them or the stereotypes that we attach to them. We are all human and fallible. We all hold these biases, even if it's uncomfortable to admit, or we don't have the insight to do so. We have a tendency to be weary of what we don't know or what defies our social norms. But the problem with biases and stereotypes is that they're just so limiting. They reduce living, breathing people with stories, aspirations, and goals to voiceless caricatures. And if we let them go unchecked, they can fester into more damaging discrimination or bigotry. A few years after this incident, I was now in a different school. I was in Year 9, and I found myself being approached by the teacher about another student. We'll call him Ahmed. He had recently migrated to Australia with his family and was having extraordinary difficulty fitting in at school. He was subject to severe bullying and racism. This took on both the verbal form, like "go back to where you came from, terrorist," and also physical abuse. He was bashed so many times that the matter ended up in court, and a restraining order was issued for his protection. Exasperated, the teacher came to me, a Year 9 student, asking ideas on how to help. I told her that what had helped me had been my story. And that's how I found myself standing in front of a sea of 7th grade students. The overarching message of my talk was about tolerance and harmony, but I used my own experiences to hone the idea home. Ahmed's biggest bully sat in the audience. Later that day, he approached me in the schoolyard. As he called out my name and I saw him coming, I swallowed a little harder. Images of him throwing Ahmed to the ground and pounding his head came to mind, which I had witnessed. I was nervous. Had my talk offended him? But my thoughts were interrupted by his voice. He said, "I just wanted to thank you for today. I really learned a lot from your talk." It turned out I had a lot to learn too. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other. What separates us is courage. the courage it takes to call out our own bias, the courage it takes to recognise injustice, or even the courage it takes to say a simple hello or strike up a conversation. Ahmed's bully had that courage. He had the courage to engage with my story, to approach me and start a conversation that allowed us to connect and dispel some of the hatred and intolerance that Ahmed faced. And most importantly, he taught me about recognising and addressing my own biases. Since then, I have made it my mission to tell as many stories as possible, in as many settings as possible. I've also shared some of my stories in writing to reach more people than I ever could have imagined. More important than my stories have been the conversations that they have led to. Some of these conversations have been with people who have found validation or a voice through my story. Perhaps because they too have been discriminated against or treated differently for the way they choose to dress, or for their faith, or for other things like their gender, the colour of their skin, their accent, or their social status. Chances are that many of you today will be able to relate. As an example, if we take you to be the microcosm of Australia, 20% of you will have experienced racial discrimination in the past year. And although I am a big advocate about being vocal and telling stories, there are many times in my life where I have not had the words to say. Sometimes this has been due to a culmination of pointed stares, offhanded comments, constantly having to explain myself, so-called microaggressions. Other times, it has happened at moments of great vulnerability. Like the time I was attacked with a chair and all I could do was curl myself up to cushion the blows. Or the times, more than one, when I had my headscarf ripped off my head and I felt like my pride was ripped off with it. On one of these occasions, I was now an adult, walking down a street with a friend. A woman approached us and stopped us. She opened her mouth and a barrage of verbal abuse was launched at me, all racial slurs. Shocked, the both of us stood in silence. What we didn't know was that further up the road, there was a bus stop. And at that bus stop, there was a young man who had taken his headphones out and was listening. He made his way down to us and intervened. It was his words, not mine, that made her stop, reconsider, and walk away. I will never know his name, but I will always admire his courage. My message to each of you here today is that you all have the capacity, the power, and the responsibility to dismantle hatred and intolerance in every interaction that you have. It doesn't matter if you're that little kid who was once bullied and shared your story, or if you're that once bully who connected with that story, or if you're that ally at the bus stop who is reframing the narrative. Never underestimate the power of your words, your stories, and your conversations as agents for change. And they don't have to be big conversations. Start with the people around you. So perhaps when you go home today, knock on your neighbour's door. Say hello. Or maybe when you go to work tomorrow, you know that person who keeps to themselves and is generally quite quiet? Approach them. Or maybe when you're scrolling on social media, that person you once had a spat with a few years ago but you're still connected, direct message them. Our voices are so much more powerful and far-reaching if we all collectively speak up and show up. Thank you. Thank you so much.